So today we're speaking with Mansib Rahman,
Yeah.
who describes himself as passionate and zealous individual interested in immersing youth into the glorious world of programming and developing all the sci-fi gadgets that should be existing already. Is that still accurate?
I think it was 18 when I read that.
Oh, really?
but if I haven't changed it, it's for a reason.
Amazing. Well, I appreciate that description anyway. And we're going to be talking about things that should be existing already. So yeah, welcome, Mansib.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Drew.
Cheers. So you're the CEO of Radish, which is a cooperative platform to bring, I'm just quoting here, bring together Canada's restaurants, couriers, and food lovers.
Yeah, I mean, it started that way.
Okay.
The scope of our activities have kind of grown beyond that, but I mean, that still holds true as well.
Yeah, so I thought of this as sort of an alternative to DoorDash or Uber Eats or something like that.
Yeah.
That was a cooperative, which
Yeah.
sounded great, but it does sound like you've really branched out into restaurant logistics, food.
Yeah, I mean, not just restaurants.
Yeah.
I mean,
Okay.
we deliver pet supplies,
Wow.
gardening supplies. We deliver almost anything. So yeah.
Okay. And just from the experiential level, how do most people sort of experience Radish? Do they experience it by going to the website and sort of ordering something, or do they experience it by calling up one of those businesses and being like, I want to order something, and then Radish is sort of
I mean, it depends on the person, right? But sometimes it's very direct. I mean, people are just ordering. They have their favorite restaurant on the platform. My restaurant's on the platform,
right?
And they just go there and order as they would with any other kind of delivery app.
Okay.
We maybe don't have all the bells and whistles that some of the other apps have, but I mean, when it comes to delivering your food, affordably, we're as good as it gets.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
But for a lot of other people, it's they're probably getting their their cat food on the platform, through another merchant that they're ordering.
Mm-hmm.
It might be.
And you're just sort of the seamless logistical link.
Yeah, exactly.
The two. Okay.
Yeah, or sometimes it's it's even before that. We're supplying the grocery store that's supplying you with the goods.
Mm-hmm.
We're bringing in decorations for a wedding, right? So
okay.
We're involved in logistics in a lot of different ways, and so it's more B2C, but some of it's more involved in behind the scenes.
I mean, I think in sort of previous interviews you've talked about how delivery, the delivery mechanism of an Uber Eats or a DoorDash is this splitting everything up into tiny little gigs that people then wait around. I think the idea is that you behind that business model is that you offload a lot of the sort of inefficiencies onto the gig worker, basically. And so the advantage for them supposedly is that they can sort of dip in and out whenever they have time to do a gig. But on the other hand, they're spending a lot of time waiting around that they're not getting paid for.
Yeah.
And so, but your insights seem to be that it's actually more reliable and more efficient to just pay drivers to be
absolutely
working in not 9 to 5, but a regular shift.
Yeah. I mean, the principal reason for us having employees is economic.
Right.
It's not purely a social thing, although that was a huge factor.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that social factors tie into the economic in the sense that a driver who's comfortable and they feel secure in their role and they feel like they're getting a good wage is actually a lot more efficient than someone who's trying to make ends meet and every
right.
gig is a hunt for them, basically, right? Though there are advantages to the Uber model for workers as well. I'm not saying it's although I don't agree with their philosophy. I think it was a net advantage for this thing to exist, but now we need to do better and propose a better model than what they have.
Mm-hmm.
And I guess to kind of touch on your earlier points on how they broke it up. I mean, their main concern wasn't really efficiency, right? Their main concern was scalability,
mm-hmm.
right? They're how do we take this thing that we've invented, this app-based model and bring it everywhere in the world?
Right.
If that to go hire every driver, right, it would take for ages,
mm-hmm.
right? It would take decades, right? And their thing was okay, how do we make it so that we just delete the HR department? So that's really their real innovation. It's
right.
We have no HR, right? We don't interview anybody. We don't, if something happens, we don't do a review. We just let them go. Everything is a resource. right? And it's not efficient economically. It's just mainly that it allows them to go into, say, like Winnipeg tomorrow and get 1,000 drivers ready, right? And then turn on. And then like if they need to turn off, right? As we saw with Amazon, which is not the same as Uber, but I can go into the details later, but they also have kind of a gig model. They can just turn off and leave, right? Like so they're not really, the anchoring they have in the communities that they're in is very they can be severed at any moment.
Yes, and in Amazon's case, they can burn people out like crazy. And and that works for their model because they just churn people through.
Yeah, and I mean they don't even do it directly, right? Because they're not only do they churn the end worker, but how their model works is they have contractors or I guess entrepreneurs that own mini fleets, right? So you pay Amazon like $10,000 and you get the rights to like a route, right? So you're like, hey, I'm going to have 5 drivers and I get this territory, right? And they assign the routes. You have to get the van from them. You have to get the gas from them, the uniform, everything. And you have to go hire drivers, right? So Amazon is shielded from the liability and the responsibility from directly employing those staff.
Right.
The contractors are employing the staff, right? And they could cut you off at any moment. So if you're an entrepreneur that has an Amazon route, right? If they don't like how you're performing, they could just cut you off within 30 days. You lose everything. But you're on the hook for like the payroll. You're on the hook for any. The driver gets into an accident, that's on you. You're going to the CNST and like getting.
So it's just like a slightly higher, like a higher complexity version of the same gig work model, basically.
I mean, it's actually
30-day time span as opposed to
it's a model
like cut off.
Well, I mean, it's a model that FedEx actually innovated.
Oh, wow.
Right. So like, and back in the day, it was having a FedEx route was very lucrative.
Sure.
Right. But over time, they've been squeezed, and Amazon just took it to a whole new level.
Yeah, that are just going to keep squeezing.
Yeah, they had algorithms and like all these different things, and like it's also very like, you have to get everything from Amazon. You can't get your own gas. You can't get your own vehicle. And you'll actually notice what's interesting is the Amazon vans, so the ones you see in Montreal or did see in Montreal.
Yeah.
None of them say Amazon on them. They just have the arrow.
Yeah.
Right. Because they're not Amazon. They're not operated by Amazon. They're operated by these fleet operators.
I see.
Which are just small business owners who are trying to make a living, and like they squeeze those owners, and those owners squeeze their employees.
Yeah.
Right. And they just kind of rely on like immigration to like just keep funneling new people in.
Right. And the model that we're talking about here is with Uber as well as with Amazon as with anything else.
Yeah.
You come into a market, you can pay a premium up front because you have all this capital.
Yeah.
Like VC cap or venture capital, or just in Amazon's case, just piles and piles of cash.
Mm-hmm.
So, and then you can pay people relatively well probably at the beginning, and then you can squeeze later once you have the sort of market dominance.
Yeah, there's definitely a hallmark of the VC model is that whenever they enter a market, the conditions are very favorable for the first participants, right? So if you're the first drivers or the first consumer, right? Like when Uber came to Montreal, like more than a decade ago, I was one of the first clients, right? And they had this coupon or this code where like to refer someone, you both get $20. Right. And I remember going and posting on the Uber blog, and like a bunch of people, would see it. And I ended up with like $400 or $500 worth of rebates on Uber. But over my lifetime, that seems like a very high acquisition cost. Right. Yet over my lifetime, I've spent over $10,000 or $20,000 on Uber. Right. To work, having to just travel, get around or send things around.
Right.
Especially prior to having my, running Radish.
So they can front load the sort of customer acquisition and also loyalty to a certain extent, because you're going to remember that, or you're going to have that sort of as your first impression, even if it costs the same as a cab now.
Yeah,
it costs like a quarter as much at the
it's way cheaper. Yeah,
and so you have this association.
Yeah.
I mean, and obviously the market share changes.
I mean, it primes a relationship with the consumer or the driver, but it doesn't. Lock-in with platforms like Uber is very low. Right? People don't really favor Uber over DoorDash to a significant degree. But how they solve this problem is through VC money, right? Because the platforms that have more money can always go reacquire another clients. Right. So like, let's say you start off with Uber and Uber gave you $50, and then you have another platform like in Montreal we had like Fedora and Golo and like a bunch of like local things that popped up and died over the years. They might come in and give you $20 rebate to join their platform. So you switch from Uber to them. But Uber has like 10 times the cash as those smaller players. So Uber just needs to spend another $20 to get you back. And they just bleed those smaller companies dry, which is how we've gradually ended up with a duopoly, right? In Montreal, you essentially have Uber and DoorDash, who probably do like 85% of the market. And then the remaining 15% is, Skip, smaller companies like Radish. There's probably one or two other smaller ones. And
so you see how this brings us back to, like, I guess the kind of key question here, which is like, obviously you have some capital, but nothing like on anywhere near the scale of a Uber or DoorDash or anyone else really. Mm-hmm. And so you don't have the ability to sort of gain market share and then squeeze the sort of your suppliers, because your suppliers are your members, but you also don't have the ability to like front load all these promotional costs and incentivize people to use your service and so on. So the obvious question, like, how's it going? Like, how do you carve out a part of the market share in that context?
Well, I think it's important to remember that as a co-op, our objectives are not the same as Uber and DoorDash. Like Uber and DoorDash needs a domination of the market to be profitable, right? Like Amazon is a textbook case. They own the market, right? Like 45% of e-commerce in Quebec is done through Amazon, right? Like let's say you're a Duracell, right? And you sell batteries. You have a choice between being on Amazon and not being on Amazon, right? If you're on Amazon, Amazon has all your data, they know your suppliers, they know your customers, and copy your product, list you right above your listing, list themselves above, your listing, and then undercut you and then sell directly to your customers and buy from your suppliers and squeeze you out. But if you're not on Amazon, no one's going to go to Duracell.ca. So like, what do? You really can't compete. And like, there's a lot of stories of how like Amazon squeezed out like diapers.com, for example, was a notable story way back, and like other, book, retailers and countless companies. Mm-hmm. But they have lost, billions over the years to do that, right? To get to that position. And now they're just, you can't, they're unassailable, really. You can't really like go up against them directly. So Uber and DoorDash are trying to do the same game, right? Like in the end, it's going to be one or two players max. Yeah. And they have it's all the same hallmarks of like the Amazon model. They control the listing, so they can control which restaurant to get promoted and in exchange for which commission. They sell data to certain players to make ghost kitchens and the like. So, it's the same thing. In the cooperatives case, our, co-op doesn't need to own the market. All a co-op needs to do is serve the interests of their members. Right? So the co-op doesn't need to be a $1 billion company. The co-op just has to, if the members are like, hey, we want to be a $1 billion company, then that's what you have to try to do. Sure. Yeah. But if they wanted to just, serve their needs, lower their costs of business, if they want you to, provide other services, that's all you have to do, right? So for a restaurant,
well, you make it sound straightforward, but I'm sure that's not.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of complexities and there's a lot more to it, obviously, especially when it comes to like marketing dollars. That it's usually where we're kind of at a big disadvantage vis-a-vis the incumbents. But I mean, again, for a co-op, like a restaurant, most people go order at a restaurant through the platforms because they like that particular restaurant, not because they like Uber or DoorDash, right? Those are restaurants we kind of target where, the consumers would order from that restaurant anyway, regardless of whichever platform, right? And so the restaurant has a certain capacity to convert all their clients over your platform if the platform does the job, is favorable to their, operations, right?
So when people go in, they can be like, order on Radish and get that extra.
Yeah, they don't have to, they can keep the other platforms on. Like I keep Uber and DoorDash on in their restaurant, but like 90% of our orders come through Radish. Okay. And that's because, we attach the flyers on social media with all our clients to order through this favorite platform. Our rates are better on Radish. So other restaurants do that. And it's not every restaurant, but it's enough that you can capture a few kind of higher margin ones, and you can actually be more efficient that way, right? Because if you're working out of 10 restaurants and you're concentrated on those rather than like 5,000 restaurants and doing just a couple on each one, your drivers are leading with more orders, right? Your drivers know the restaurant, they know the clients. It's the same dynamic again and again.
Yeah, it's funny. In the restaurant across the street, I noticed there's all these signs being like, "Oh, you must show this ID. You must do this," because obviously, like, you're in this like super alienated framework where like some randos coming in, If they don't have their like Uber bag on, they're just gonna grab some food and leave.
Yeah, I mean,
like,
people do that, right? Like, people do like they've had to establish protocols to prevent that. Because I mean, when
there's no relationship. Yeah,
exactly. Yeah, when it's so decoupled, I mean, everyone's just kind of it's everyone's just trying to. It's almost a zero-sum game. Everyone's trying to kind of play against each other, right? Because the only way to really succeed, right, is like, hey, how do I game the system? Because Uber is gaming everybody in that equation, right? And as they need to, like their model only it's not. I don't want to say it's necessarily an evil thing. It's more like they need to do that to be viable.
Sure.
Right. So yeah.
You can say that's evil.
Yeah, I mean,
I'll say it.
Yeah. I mean, it's I guess we're a bit of a different position, but
I need to quote you on that. But I'll offer that up as my perspective. But yeah, so I guess speaking of the needs of the members, I'd love to just go through each of your member classes. So you have sort of restaurant and supplier members.
Yeah.
You have sort of worker members, so drivers and maybe other developers.
Myself.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And then you have user members.
Yeah.
And each one has a third. Am I understanding that correctly?
Yeah. So
of the board seats.
Yeah, exactly. So merchants, workers, and all the workers are employees, by the way.
Mm-hmm.
The drivers are all employed.
Right.
They're salaried. And then consumers as well. And the board is divided into three, right? So they each have 33% of the seats.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And that kind of ensures that, like, if any motion is passed, it at least needs the support of like two of the member classes.
Yep.
Right. And that's how you kind of balance the interest, because naturally everyone has like their own interests, right? Like the drivers want to get paid as much as possible for the least amount of effort, which is totally normal. Mm-hmm. Right. And then consumers want to pay the least possible and get it as quickly as possible.
Mm-hmm.
And, merchants, want to, again, sell the most while paying the least possible.
Of course, yeah.
So like, all those interests kind of, they kind of go against each other, right? So to make sure that we can kind of bring them, to an equilibrium, we have this model where you need the support of multiple classes to like move things forward.
That's great. And so, yeah, what is the value? Can you get into a little more of what the value proposition is for example, restaurant?
Yeah, I mean, it's cheaper. When you need help with something, where you can contact us directly with the phone number of a person, or at the very least, it's the same 2 or 3 people that are handling your case.
Mm-hmm.
Not only is it the same support, but they get the same drivers, right? And so the drivers almost kind of become an extension of the restaurant or the segments, not just cars, because it's the same people. Like they sometimes like we have some drivers who carry around like, and this is a thing that was very common back in the day, but with Uber has become less common. But they carry around drinks or they carry around cutlery, so like they don't have to go back to the restaurant and get something if they're missing something, mm-hmm. right? Mm-hmm. The restaurant, sometimes they call the driver to be like, hey, like I forgot something, so you're correcting errors way earlier. That in the trajectory, so you're more efficient in that regard. The consumers that are ordering at your place, so like you actually kind of tailor the food to their liking, because again, it's the same clients. Like we have, one of our top clients who's been ordering at my restaurant for the last 5 years has ordered nearly 300 times since the pandemic when they started, and it's like always the same order, and it's always around the same time, and it's usually the same driver that's doing it, right? Which I think kind of brings it back to how things were to a certain extent in the past, where you had the relationship, right? And that's why our motto, our original slogan was "Restaurer la restauration," right? Like restoration, but not just, in the sense that we're bringing back the relationships that Uber has kind of, been looking to decouple, as we mentioned mm-hmm. earlier. Yeah, so I mean, I think that's what the advantages are. They have a say in the governance of the organization, mm-hmm. right? If they're not happy with a fee or something like that, they have recourse, right, to something they don't have for the platforms, right? I mean, one of the original reasons we started was because we were using Uber, and like whenever we had a problem, we'd be connected to a call center in the Philippines, and they weren't speaking English or French simply because we were routed to the wrong call center, right? I had one of our early members, like they couldn't get their DoorDash store open for the first 2 weeks because the store, for some reason, was opened online in Mexico City, and they just couldn't get it corrected. There's no way to like tell the system, I can't just
Where else? Just show. Yeah, give me.
yeah, it's almost like trying to deal with like an insurance company, right?
Yeah.
So yeah, I mean, those are the advantages. I mean, now again, like we're still small, so there are,
And do they pay less for? Do they get to keep a larger amount of their?
Yeah, I mean, we're on average we're maybe 30 to 35% cheaper than the other platform.
Okay.
Right, and the other thing is our commission is the same for every merchant.
Mm-hmm.
Right, or there might be some short-term onboarding discounts, but like we don't do like you get like a 22% and you get a 29%, and like everyone's kind of like trying to negotiate their own rates. If we have to give a discount to a large merchant, we have to give it to a smaller merchant, right? Mm-hmm. And that's to put everyone on a level playing field. Because one of the other issues with these platforms is that it favors kind of industrial type, establishments, mm-hmm. right? Because the multinational fried chicken chain, can do higher margins, right? Because everything comes from a factory, right? Whereas the mom and pop can't, so they pay lower commissions. They can only afford to pay lower commissions to Uber, but then Uber or DoorDash is going to list them on the third or fourth page after, the kind of industrial
McDonald's or whatever.
Yeah, and so consumers don't see them as much, and they play in other ways too, right? Like they'll keep more drivers around the more higher margin restaurants, right? A little more to win, so the consumers feel that these restaurants deliver faster. And if you're using an app, often it's because you want things more conveniently and quicker.
Of course. Yeah.
Right? So like if your impression is that these recommended places are going to be quicker, faster, you're going to go there, right? So it's a very, very kind of nefarious circle. And our goal has really been to kind of break that circle and again, apply a level playing field, simply because, if we don't do it, there's no one else to really do it. Like it's beyond the scope of the government to like kind of, regulate this kind of stuff, right? To a certain extent. So, I mean, that like, some of our kind of impacts on the merchants are very direct, like lower commissions. Some of them are very indirect, which is like, we're kind of preserving the environment in which they operate.
Can you give me a window into, so you have, restaurant owners and then you have drivers.
Yeah.
And one would imagine that the interests of those people are aligned to a certain extent, but then drivers are going to want more wages and, lower workloads, and the restaurant owners are ostensibly going to want, to some extent, the opposite.
Yeah.
Lower wages and higher workloads.
Yeah.
And more efficiency. So, I mean, without violating confidentiality, I'd love to get a sense of what does it look like on the board? Like, how do those discussions play out in terms of the worker members and the restaurant?
Yeah, absolutely.
And how they talk to each other and negotiate.
I mean, the same situation exists for the incumbents as well. It's just that for the incumbents, there's no discussion, right? Like what Uber does is that, if they see a lot of, lashback, like during COVID, like they added delivery fee caps. They'll just shift the burden onto a different member class. They'll either raise the consumer rates or like decrease the driving payouts, right? And then drivers are going to start striking, and then they might shift it to another class, right? That's their way of handling it.
Divide and conquer.
Yeah, in the case of the cooperative, we have the discussions up front on the board.
Sure.
Right. So, it like discourse is, the antidote to like these kind of class frictions.
Yeah.
Right. Like when you don't have that, that's when you have like these big issues.
Yeah.
Right. So instead you have smaller discussions that are less heated.
I can imagine it's more human. I mean, there's a scenario where it's more humanistic. There's also a scenario where it just leads to conflict that tears apart the co-op. But I guess,
but I mean,
I'm curious how you
the thing is like
ride that line.
I mean, the more frequent the discussions, right, the less heated it gets because people can kind of blow off the tension. You can't do that. If you can't get it off your shoulder and like you're just, you're just like subject to whatever the platform decides for you. That's where it heats up. That's where you start seeing, drivers or cyclists wanting to unionize, right, or merchants, like boycotting a platform or consumer boycotting a platform is because they're like, hey, I have like no recourse other than like just doing this very drastic action. Whereas when you have a system which is kind of, which enables discussion, then you always know that, there is, you can always compromise on things. You can always discuss things, right? And, I don't think people want to antagonize a working relationship just to, get an extreme benefit, right? The merchants want better rates. They want to pay less, but, they're not going to antagonize all the drivers and then not, especially when they know the drivers and they see them every day and they know their faces, they're not going to antagonize them to a point where they're not going to want to deliver for them, right? Or same thing for the drivers. Like, they understand that, the margins in this business are quite low, right? So they're going to want to preserve the structure so that, they can preserve their jobs, right?
Sure.
In a way, it's kind of like building the union into the company rather than having to. And that's why I wanted to do a co-op. And it's not a dig at unions at all, right? It's just that, in a lot of companies, it's made by this capital class that disregards the employee concerns, and then the employees have to force that concern, through unionizations or other mechanisms down the line, and it creates a lot of friction. We're like, hey, let's have that from the get-go. So they're not kind of fighting to be heard; they're already at the table.
And I'm so curious because this has become sort of at a certain level an issue of identity in the workplace, in the sense that you're thinking of yourself not as an employee. I mean, obviously you are an employee, but also thinking of yourself as like part owner, and sort of director of this entity that you're working for. And so I'm just curious how that's evolved. I mean, you've been around for several years now. 5 years, I guess.
Yeah, 4 or 5.
4, yeah. So yeah, I'm curious, how have you seen that evolve at the restaurant level, at the different member types? Like, how have you seen people sort of grow into that role of being a part owner as well as a customer or an employee?
Yeah, I mean, we're still a young company, but I mean, we're older than we were a few years ago. And when we started, right, the idea of our co-op surviving into year 3 or year 5 was, almost foreign, right? So of course, the nature of the relationship members have with cooperative has changed, where, in the early years, people, very opinionated on how things should be done. And over time, people have kind of settled into a working relationship. And even though we're still quite dynamic and there's still this kind of, need to like always be innovating and changing the way we do things to be more efficient, people are also comfortable to a certain extent with how we operate, right? So like the larger questions have been answered for now. I mean, there'll probably be other milestones, and of course expand and whatever, where those questions come back up. So yeah, I mean, and also the types of members have changed, right? I mean, initially we had a lot of restaurants during the pandemic that no longer exist today. So those members don't exist, right? But in turn, we've also enlisted a lot of members who are not restaurants, right? Like other types of merchants, food producers or bakeries or fishmongers.
And how do they understand being part of a co-op? Like, is it sort of intuitive to them? Like, because there's different associations that they're part of?
Yeah, I mean, I was surprised.
Is this something you have to educate from scratch?
Surprisingly more intuitive than I thought. I was familiar with the co-op model prior to my previous job at Desjardins, which is large financial cooperatives. But for a lot of people, I mean, surprisingly, like a lot of immigrants, like they were familiar with the model from, from the past, right? From other aspects of their life or other, past experiences. So I think people are roughly familiar with the model. And, I think co-ops are interesting in that like every co-op kind of operates very differently. Corporations have a lot of diversity, and co-ops have even more diversity than that, right? So I think people got kind of get used to it as they go along. I mean, they get a certain amount of onboarding, and for some members, like their interaction with the co-op is very transactional, and it's fine. There's no need to, if you're part of a grocery co-op, you don't need to be involved in every aspect of the business. You can just be supporting them by going and buying, right, as being a member. And for others, they're very, they have a lot of ideas and they want to contribute, and they want to tell their other merchant friends about the co-op, or other workers tell their other worker friends or their friends to order, right? So you see a varied degree of participation, and the participation also is not constant. And and then that kind of reflects democracy, where you have, some individuals who are very, public with, how things should be done. And then you have other individuals who, are very private. You have all kinds of, you have a large spectrum of participation. But the biggest thing is that you have the option, which is something that doesn't exist in a corporation, where no matter how much you want to participate, there's always this kind of firewall between you and the actual governance of the organization, beyond, going and buying, copious amounts of their share or something like that.
Yeah, of course. Yeah, and I guess coming back to the board dynamics, I'm super curious how that plays out. The 1/3, 1/3, 1/3 model, where you have these 3 member types and nobody has an outright majority.
Yeah.
Often in sort of what is sort of recommended is to have one dominant sort of type, and then one sort of, seat at the table, but not able to like vote down anybody else. But so what I would imagine is that you'd sort of end up with a sort of de facto governing coalition of 2 of those member types. So whether it's I'm just imagining, but you tell me, but restaurant owners and customers sort of pairing up to make sure that costs stay low, or it could be, user members and workers being like, okay, we're in solidarity. We're going to make sure that people get paid really well.
Yeah.
And we're willing to pay a little extra and more of a fair trade model. I don't know. But, so I can imagine a lot of different scenarios, but I'm curious, is there a stable sort of coalition, or is it pretty dynamic and more consensus based?
I'd say it's pretty consensus based. I mean, we can imagine that maybe, 10 or 20 years on the line when we're a lot larger, right? And the co-op, it's not a direct relationship between the highest.
Yeah, when you have a lot of that assembly of 300 members that all come and sit in different parts of the.
Yeah, well, I mean, especially when you have like a greater diversity of geographies,
sure,
right, and cultures, right? I think that's, because it's harder to have, when people say class solidarity, that's often very local, right? Like people have solidarity with the people of that class in their community, right? And like, of course, we all say, like, everyone says like, hey, I have a solidarity with the worker class worldwide. But like the worker class worldwide is extremely varied, right, and diverse.
It's very difficult.
Yeah,
in solidarity.
Yeah, and like the buy-in from everybody is not the same. Like you can like often the challenge is that like you're speaking for people who might say different things if they were asked directly, right? So I don't think we've reached that point where we're so large that you have a class that's trying to represent workers, and they're workers in like 20 different regions, and they actually have different needs because, their provinces are different. Like, I'm sure the needs of a worker in Alberta are very different than the ones in Quebec, right? We don't have that issue where they're arguing for different things, right? So for that reason, I haven't seen any large kind of like movements where like, 2 classes are kind of trying to subjugate a third one. And, the thing is, there's enough issues where every class is partnered with another class for something, right?
Interesting.
It's hard to, it's difficult to see. Like there's, it's not just like we're talking about one thing, which is price, right? There's pricing, there is like worker rights, there's a level of quality, there's like marketing, there's language, there's financing of the cooperatives, and everyone has like different opinions on that. And it's rare that you see like all of it falling in line with like 2 classes and not, the third, right? And even within the class, you have a lot of kind of diversity in that. Like you have larger and smaller merchants who have different needs, right? Like a mom and pop has a very different need than a medium-sized business with 50 employees, right? Or in the workers, you have drivers and cyclists, which already don't share the same.
Of course,
cyclists, are much more interested in, personal insurance, for example. Whereas drivers are interested in like vehicle insurance or subsidies in regards to the maintenance of their vehicle, which is much more costly than a bike, of course. And then on top of that, you have people who don't even have vehicles because they work in corporate, right? So I haven't seen that kind of issue.
Tricky. Yeah. No, it sounds fascinating. It sounds like you've been able to maintain a certain level of dynamism and sort of.
But it's still early, right? It could happen. I'm not saying we're insulated from that problem.
Yeah, I was going to say, it sounds like you're also maybe a little bit worried about how this is going to scale if you.
I mean, I wouldn't say I'm worried about it. I think it's more like it can happen.
That's something you're going to have to adapt to.
Yeah, and we just need to be cognizant of the fact that it could happen. Really, you don't want to what you want to avoid, which is what the other platforms have, is becoming very large and then having to have these kind of foundational issues that you can't correct anymore. Right, that's been very important for us. Like we were kind of created as a response to these foundational issues, so we have to kind of anticipate them so that we can course correct before getting to that destination.
And speaking of sort of, I guess where you're at, is it still just a Montreal based?
No, actually, I mean we deliver basically between Montreal, Quebec City, and Sherbrooke. That kind of triangle.
Oh, wow. Okay.
I mean, not for food delivery. The food delivery is very localized in the center of the island. So we haven't really expanded in the past year or two. But our other, kind of logistics operations, which at this point is probably 90% of our business is.
Oh wow! Okay.
Yeah.
So tell me about that. I want 90% sounds like a lot.
Yeah. I mean, it's. I mean, we started off as a food delivery cooperative. That was the original need, and as the COVID kind of wind down happened, the food delivery market shrunk considerably. I think long term it's still going to keep going up, but in the near term, a lot of restaurants who are going bankrupt. So every time a restaurant disappeared, they took a huge chunk of revenue. Right? You were doing say $1,000 of revenue with them per week, and then they're gone. Well, I mean, they $4,000. That's the wage of a driver and a bit more sometimes, right? So as you started losing those restaurants, and you also had restaurants reopening, so not focusing on delivery, especially the kind of nicer restaurants. Mm-hmm. We had to diversify into other activities. So that's when we entered, parcel delivery or delivery of goods from, catering or florists, or cake shops, gift baskets, coffee, pretty much anything. Really, we supply a lot of supermarkets with prepared goods from local restaurants and small businesses. So yeah, I mean, one segment of that, a big part of that is like doing intercity right now, right? Because if you're a merchant, like 60% of your business in Montreal, you still have another 30 or 40% that's outside of Montreal, and you want to kind of centralize with one carrier, right? So, we've been gradually expanding, and I think long term, it's going to allow us to eventually launch the kind of direct or food delivery model in other cities, right? Once you have a larger footprint there, because we already have drivers, we already have staff.
And how many staff overall are we talking now?
I think right now we have around 25 to 30 employees, including drivers.
Okay.
Yeah. So I mean, smaller than other transporters, but larger than, I guess when we were 2 years ago.
And what does that growth curve look like? What did you look like 2 years ago?
I mean, in terms of staff,
which would have been, I guess, the midpoint of your entire life cycle at this point. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean,
not cycle, but your life.
Yeah. I mean, I think, we were probably like 10 to 15 employees. It varied a lot, right? Because in the pandemic, you had a lot of part-time staff, right? Part-time drivers. So you have high accounts, but, not full employee. Whereas now, gradually, we've been able to kind of build it around full-time employees.
Okay.
Right. Which has been, I guess, a kind of a personal success story of ours.
Right. So in terms of full-time equivalent, maybe the growth would even be bigger in terms of.
Oh yeah.
Number of, for the 40 hours.
Yeah. Because I mean, we before we had a lot of people who were doing maybe 10 to 20 hours a week.
Right.
Whereas like now you have 35 to 40 hour individuals. And then on top of that, you have part-time individuals as well, time to time, seasonal as well. So, and
all Quebec so far, no Corval.
I mean, occasionally we do Ottawa, right? But that's as far as we'll go. So I mean, we'll deliver from merchant who's delivering products to supermarkets there.
Okay.
To be seen which direction we go, if we go anywhere else.
And do you have delivery trucks as well? Like, what does this look like? Okay.
Yeah, I mean, we have electric cargo vans, we have cargo bikes, we have cars, we have all types of transports.
Okay. And I understand, like, sort of inventory tracking and sort of supply chain monitoring is a part of your business. How like, and so can you talk a little bit about that and how that works?
Yeah. I mean, in between now and the pandemic, we had piloted inventory tracking for restaurants, right? So managing, since we already had all the data around what people are ordering, it was kind of easy to kind of go back and, be like, oh, hey, like you sold 20 pizzas on Radish this week. That probably means that, you used, I don't know, 4 cans of tomato sauce and, 10 kilos of flour, right? So you can kind of measure utilization of raw ingredients, right? And track that in a way where the staff, don't have to write everything down manually, which was the case in the past. Which again, because it was done manually, most places didn't even really do it, even if they said they were doing it. The goal with that was to reduce food costs by, telling a merchant like, oh, hey, like, the weather's going to be, but it's going to be very rainy in the next few weeks. You probably want like more soups and less salads, right? And so order more, more of these products over those products, right? And also in turn, reducing food waste. So that's something we piloted. I mean, I think there's a lot of potential with the product. The challenge is, post-pandemic, it's been very hard to get restaurants to invest in kind of, exploratory technologies. In a way, they're more open to explore them. In a way, they're less resourced to be exploring those things.
I can see how you'd have to get pretty fine-grained with the workflow in terms of like, oh, we bought this many cans of whatever this week.
Well, I mean, that's the beauty of this, right? Because the system can kind of detect the utilization based on the sales, right? Because you can scan the receipt.
You only have the subset of the delivery, or do you have access to the whole?
Well, system their POS for.
Okay. Oh, okay.
Yeah, their POS.
So you can integrate that.
Yeah, okay. And I mean, the thing with the recommendations is that there's different levels of
Sorry, POS being point of sale.
Point of sale, yeah. But yeah, like I was saying, depending on how much access you have, you can be more or less granular, right? Because the recommendations that a lot of restaurants need, it's not like you need 2.6 cans of tomato sauce, right? What they need is like, hey, you should just buy half as much this week.
Yeah.
Right? Or buy more, right? So even if you have 10% of their sales data, that's enough to kind of extrapolate. It's not perfect, but you're not telling the owner or the purchasing staff exactly what to do. You're giving an indication of what they should be doing, right?
And so in theory, that sounds like a great way to reduce sort of food waste and also save some money. Do you have a sense of like the kind of dollar figures or like percentage figures?
It could be tens of thousands of dollars a year for a restaurant, right? Because like the challenge is without that, everything is a lagging indicator, right? Like you're not being it's only when you start losing the money that you realize that you're losing money.
Exactly.
Right. So restaurants, especially smaller businesses, only take action months after they have to take action. Another avenue is menu prices, right? Like you might be losing money on the menus and you only realize when you've been losing money for 2 months and you're like, you look at the bank statement and you're like, I have less this month, right? That's how small businesses operate. They're not getting super up-to-date information.
Yeah.
Right. Whereas like, the kind of insight that we can provide is very like,
leading indicators. Yeah.
Right. It's very much like, hey, like just in the last week, you've been losing money. Right. Just in the last few days, you've been losing money. Like this might continue. Right. The weather's going to go up, or like you can look at like commodities pricing. Like you look at like the price of oil. You can look at the price of wheat. Right. Which are very common, so easily accessible data points.
Can you feed those things in and be like predictably be like, our model is looking at commodity prices, is looking at the weather, and can basically say you have a like 60% chance of like losing $500 next week.
Yeah. I mean, it doesn't really give a percentage chance of losing it.
Well, I mean,
we try to be kind of nuanced with how we present the information, right? Because you don't want to say there's a X percentage chance, and then merchants are like kind of like trying to bet. So you don't.
No, I understand. But what does it look like for them? I guess is the question.
Yeah, I mean, it's you're sometimes you're just kind of presenting the facts of like what has happened, and you're letting them kind of prescribe the action, right? And for some other things, you're kind of prescribing things because the granularity of the data is better,
right?
So you're able to be like, oh, I know exactly how much rice you use, and so you can, like this is how much rice we think you're going to need.
Right.
So it depends on like how much data you have and like and the type of merchant as well. And
so what does that look like? They get an email that says it's going to be rainy for the next 2 weeks. Your lemonade sales are going to go down by 50%. Like what?
Yeah, I mean it's a dashboard. It's a dashboard that you can access online, and often it's after just like talking to our staff, right? Because a lot of our staff have worked in restaurants, right? So you're given, so it's an owner to owner situation, right? Or a staff member to owner or staff member to staff situation where they're kind of explaining it as if they were working at the restaurant, right? It's kind of just advice or insight like that, which I think is another kind of interesting aspect of the co-op, which is that, not everything is, technological. Right? A lot of it is just kind of institutional or being part of the community.
I want to zoom out a little bit and talk about, I guess, you're part of it's basically a tech startup, but there's, obviously there's a significant number of co-ops in Montreal that are tech, in the tech sector, but obviously you're smaller than the sort of dominant startup sort of culture. So I'm curious, how do you relate to the tech sector and startup culture? And
yes. I mean, we're kind of really a unique intersection, because even though they're kind of tech forward co-ops, there aren't a lot of, not just in Quebec, but worldwide, there aren't a lot of product based co-ops, right? Often the tech co-ops, it's like consulting, or they're providing hosting or a service. In our case, you're kind of building a product that's competing with a mainstream product. And so we're kind of like, the black sheep of both worlds, right? Not in a bad way. Like it's not like we're hated by any ecosystem. It's just that, when you go to the tech world, right? Like, it's very hard to tell a VC why they should take a risk, not on your product, but on your legal structure, right? Like you typically don't want to innovate on the legal structure. And in our case, as a co-op, we're also our co-op structure is very different than traditional co-op structure, right? Because we can raise venture capital unlike pretty much any other co-op. And we have like the multi-stakeholder model. And like you mentioned, typically even with the multi-stakeholder models, you tend to see a dominant class. And you see a smaller class, like kind of appended down the line. In our case, it was built to be like egalitarian from the get-go. And yeah, so I mean, it's been interesting. I mean, we try to partake in both worlds. We hire from both worlds. I don't think we've really been at odds with anyone. It's just, we're kind of a bit different, and we have to always try to chart a new path forward, right? Every time we try to do something.
What happens, for example, when you hire somebody who's like used to the tech world into your co-op? Like what do they have to learn to like be able to function?
I mean, we don't try to make it so that you have to learn a whole bunch of lore before you can be useful, right? Like our goal is really to ease people at it.
Sure.
The co-op is kind of kind of underpins everything we do, but it's not something necessarily that you have to, if you're coding a certain piece of infrastructure, you don't need to necessarily know every detail about the co-op. Though it helps, right? Because, you'll probably know that like, hey, we have requirements as to how our data is kept. That's a bit different than the other platforms, right? Like, we will never sell our data, right? Because, they belong to our members, or, there's certain types of products or services that will favor, or, we try to procure kind of ethically. But those are things that I think kind of come up in more innocuous ways day to day. It's not something we try to like hammer into people. And I think, when we hire, we kind of filter for that kind of culture fit to a certain extent. We don't say like, oh, hey, you have to have this political leaning, or you have to have these values to join. It's more like, this is the type of organization we're in. So, ideally we want to kind of get along to a certain extent. And, sometimes we'll hire people with very polar opposite political leanings to what the mainstream of the organization is. But the important thing is that, there is the discourse is polite, or the discourse is acceptable, and is a discourse that can kind of build, positive interactions, right? Rather than conflictual ones.
Of course.
Yeah. So yeah, I mean, we haven't really seen, I think that's kind of been self-perpetuating in a way where like you're getting employees that ultimately want the co-op to succeed, right? For the reasons that the co-op, has laid out has laid out for its existence, right? It's not like it's something that people kind of like subconsciously kind of pick up, rather than us having to be like, hey, like, these are the three values you always have to respect and live by, right? And a lot of organizations, a lot of CEOs and organizations advocate for these value models, like where you have to like 3 values or like 5 values, and it's often like you have to be respect and move quick, and everyone has this stuff, and I'm like it's very static, and people interpret those things very differently, right? So
it sounds like your approach is maybe more relational.
Yeah, it's more relational and it's more malleable. Like I like it's actually very interesting because, I think over the years you also get cohorts of staff, right? People come in because conditions in the world make a certain group of people come into your organization, right? Like the people who are joining the organization during the pandemic are very different than the people joining today, right? I remember like there's one or 2 years where we had a lot of like neurodivergent people joining the cooperative, right? ADHD, bipolar, like I think it was like 70% of the organization, right? And then the next year it was less, and it was not something we kind of like went out to be like we're going to hire more of these individuals or less of these individuals. It's just that when you had one individual, it just kind of made it more inclusive towards other individuals, and then like organically that increased. And like when those people started moving on to other, they want to go on to go do their masters or go travel or something, they changed the character of the organization. And it's been really interesting to see how we've been kind of organically evolving in that regard without us being like, we want a certain type of individual or we want people to, for sure, believe in a certain thing.
I guess coming back to what you're saying, you're saying sort of black sheep in both the tech sector and the co-op sector. And you started out you sort of started your career, as I understand it, at Desjardins.
No, I mean, prior to that,
part of your career at Desjardins.
Yeah, I mean, I had a few years at Desjardins. I mean, prior to that, I'd worked at Microsoft. I was also consultant for a few years, and then manufacturing.
So you really got a solid slice of life from both.
Yeah,
from sort of the solid cooperative worlds in terms of Desjardins. Yeah. For listeners who might not be in Quebec or Canada, like a massive credit union that is like with the biggest bank in Quebec, I think. Yeah.
I mean, they're not a bank, but yeah, a large financial institution.
Exactly.
They have
that corrected.
They're one of not just the largest in Quebec, but one of the largest in the world. Right. They have, I think, today probably $400 billion of assets in their management. So a lot of weight.
400 billion. That's not nothing. But did that experience sort of tell me about how that experience sort of inspired or informed or gave you things to not do, I guess, as well.
Yeah,
in terms of how you.
I mean, absolutely. I mean, there's a lot of things I admire about Desjardins. I mean, especially around its founding story with their founders who were very quick, very startup like, actually, right? We often have this kind of like preconceived notion that like legacy things are not quick, or slow, but like they were a lot quicker than a lot of startups today.
Well, they sort of rode around from community to community, setting up.
Yeah, I mean, I'm going to mention this anecdote the last time, but I'm not sure to the extent of the veracity of this anecdote. I saw it on their website at some point, and then I never found it again. But from what I understood, one of the founders, Alphonse, right, in the span of 29 days, opened 11 branches in Ontario on horseback with just like a safe, so. And it was pre-internet, pre-fax, pre-anything, right? And it was in the early 1900s.
The stuff of legends.
Yeah, and
like 400 billion.
Exactly, and then if you think about that, we can't even open 11 branches today.
No.
Where that all the technology, all the stuff, like any startup who were to do that today, it'd be like the fastest startup this decade, right? To be able to be growing that quickly, 1 month and 11 physical branches on horse. So yeah, I mean, like there's this notion that like co-ops are kind of slow or like things in the past were kind of slow, and that's simply not true. They have very strong network effects, which is something else that is very important for tech startups. Where like he was relying on the church actually to spread the message, right? Like they would always open a kiss in front of a church because the priest, right, would be telling their constituents like, hey, like invest your money here. It's going to give us, kind of autonomy from like the usurious kind of lending practices of the merchant class. And so like it kind of spread like that. And it's something that people really neglect. Again, like they had no technology, or they had technology, but they had no like modern communications technology to enable them to do that. Yeah, I mean, so I guess going back to your question, I mean, some of the things that I think with Desjardins changed over time, one of the areas where they were definitely lacking was the retention of talent, right? Because Desjardins doesn't have shares, or if they have shares, they're not equity shares that go up in value. And the thing is, strong performers and executives often rely on those stock options or other forms of share compensation to be incited to work at a company, right? So you're never going to hire someone who'd go work at a Google or Microsoft or whatever to go work at an institution like that long term, because even if they perform, even if they have an outsized impact on the organization, their total compensation is quite limited to another organization, right? And you could say like, hey, like I could, like maybe I don't want that much money, but I can't like require that of like a whole generation of developers, other individuals, right? So that was definitely a big piece for us, was like, hey, how do we build in this kind of incentive structure in the co-op, in a way that keeps the governance kind of structurally sound, but still giving economic incentives to high performers, right? I think that's one thing we did very differently.
And so my understanding is you've sort of decoupled equity from political control, like control of the intellectual property and the political direction of the co-op.
Yeah, I mean the governance and the economic interests are split, right? Mm-hmm. They can be held by the same members, but they don't have to be held by the same members. Ultimately, the decision.
It sounds like you are keeping them held. There is a significant overlap in that diagram of owners and.
Yeah, I mean it's above 90% or 95%.
Okay,
for now. But ultimately, it's a question of whether the members want to sell their economic rights. If they want to sell them, they should have the right to do that, right? So you're allowing people to be like, hey, like I'd rather have the cash up front, and someone else can get the upside.
Yes.
And then other members, drivers might be like, hey, I'm just going to hold on to this until they retire, right? And that's fair either way. And it's something that it's something that's very unique in the co-op world, but that exists in the traditional world. Right?
It seems like you'd still want to have a significant amount of overlap, in the sense that if you want investors to trust you to manage a co-op and get decent returns, then you'd want the people running the co-op to have the incentive for it to.
I mean, personally, yes, I would like the alignment to always be there, where the members also want the growth of the cooperative, right? So it's a win-win. But if at any given point the members are like, hey, I don't know, there's a really bad year, economic crisis due to bad investments, we need to raise money. So we're going to sell off a portion of the co-op's equity or the economic rights, either for a short duration of time or for an indeterminate duration of time. They should have the right to do that, right? Mm-hmm. And actually, that already happens in the co-op world. I mean, like often, they sell shares, right? It's just the shares don't change in value, but the amounts are so significant, especially when they're buying something like a building, that effectively the economic rights are already kind of surrendered to investors. And like I know stories of like grocery co-ops and stuff who like, couldn't make the decisions they needed to make because their hands were held by their investors, which are co-op investors, right? So, So you already kind of have that. So if you're going to have that, you might as well kind of be forthcoming about it, right? So that the members are better educated about their tools that they have at their disposition, right? What you want, like what I want to avoid is, members having to get these significant loans or investments from lenders who are supposedly, co-op forward, but ultimately still have control and can kind of be like, hey, if you don't change your management or if you don't change the members don't vote for this, we're going to pull out of our investment. We're going to call back our loan or line of credit. I mean, that comes down to the same thing, right?
Yeah, but it's a financial negotiation as opposed to, you have the impossibility of, I guess, at least within that structure, to the extent that it stays that structure, you have the possibility of like a hostile takeover, but you do have the possibility of like some hard-headed negotiations between the members and the investors at some point.
Yeah, but I mean, like, the hostile takeover, I mean, is really just a nuance, right? Because, all the investors have to do is recall your loans in the traditional sense.
No, for sure.
And then you default. When you and then when you default, where does the assets go? Right? I mean, some co-op laws, there's some protections in place, but I mean, as we saw with the Mountain Equipment Co-op, right? Like the board was able to just sell everything off to private equity.
Right. Arguably, they should have been prevented, but yeah, that didn't happen legally.
Well, I mean, yes and no, right? Because the bankruptcy law takes precedence.
That's true.
And without that, I mean, you wouldn't be able to have, at least in the kind of economic environment that we're in, you wouldn't be able to have, financing, right? Because what lender is going to like put that money in place if, they can't, they can't rely on things like bankruptcy law to like, exit their position. Right.
Yeah.
So unless the members are coming in with their own funds, right? I guess the challenge.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I think the board seemed to be sort of pre-conditioned in the Mex case to like sell it off. Otherwise, they could have gone to the members and say, okay, we need to like create a advocacy campaign to get a bridge loan for like 6 months to like figure this out from the government. Because like it's not like people aren't going to see the value in like keeping.
Yeah. But I mean, it's a slippery slope type situation where like, it's paved, the road is paved with good intentions, right? Like it's not, they didn't just elect 1 year a bad board member who decided to make this their personal mission.
Yeah, no, I mean,
it's like actually the challenge is that for co-ops like Mountain Equipment Co-op, where it's a consumer co-op, you have very low, the adhesion from the members, like the consumers are very, with the exception of the original members, right?
Yeah.
Those co-ops require large economies of scale to survive, right? Because they're competing with Walmart and like other regular big box stores.
Mm-hmm.
So they have to take in a lot of members. And when you take in a lot of members really quickly, they're not attached to the co-op. So they don't go on votes, right? And that's the problem that a lot of consumer co-ops have, is that the average member does not vote. Like you look at Desjardins, the average member does not vote, right? So the direction of the co-op gradually goes towards like increased, consolidation of power in certain individuals, right? So, like our argument, and we'll see how it holds up, and we might be terribly wrong, but we want to give more latitude to the members from the get-go and to make those decisions, right? Like if they're surrendering rights, like the rights can be taken from them anyway, and usually happens due to a disparity in knowledge, right? You have like these sophisticated investors and other individuals whose job is to protect their interests, right? And so they're always negotiating at a huge advantage. So our goal is to provide those tools to our members so that when they enter those negotiations, they have the tools to sell out in the way that benefits them, right?
Absolutely,
or protects their interests, rather than if one day down the line, and I would be against this personally, but if one day down the line, let's say I'm dead, all the members get together and like, hey, we're going to demutualize, right, and sell our assets. Like, that's your prerogative, right? You should have the right.
I mean, sort of. You're selling out all the future members at that point, and you're also selling out all the past members' work, and to basically taking a snapshot of the membership at a particular point in time and saying, okay, all the work that all these previous people did who are no longer around for whatever.
Yeah, but I mean, the member
is going to like now benefit us.
But the membership, truly reflects the interests of the members. It doesn't reflect interests of future or past members, right? Like you open a small,
but I would say it should, in the sense. I mean, there at a certain point there's community equity, like in like MEC, for example, Mountain Equipment Co-op. You end up with, this is much greater than the sum of its parts.
Yeah,
like, I mean, in the end, individual members got nothing. They just lost their ability to have a co-op that they part.
Yeah, but the buy-in from the individual member was low, which is
exactly.
Yeah, it's like if you're not involved in democracy, you're gonna get what's picked for you, right? Like,
no, it's
without going on.
And in the US, that's a good example.
Yeah. So I mean, it's again, as much as I personally liked, it comes to, you can make a lot of parallels, for example, with, housing and the boomer generation, right? Do they have a certain responsibility to sell their houses at a more affordable price, right? In the case of like if in like let's take that analogy to the co-op.
Yeah.
Should the co-op be protecting my interests?
Yeah.
When I'm retired from Radish?
Yeah.
Should I be held up as like like the glorious founder, and like my vision kind of like kept as like a profit, or should it reflect the needs of its members 50 years from now who are totally different than me, right? And probably don't have anything to do with me, right? Yeah. Should we as a country, be reflecting the interests of like John A. McDonald to this day? Like,
no, I mean, it is up to the members, but I think, anyway, I guess a bit of a tangent, but I think there is the mutualization. It seems like it's hard to find examples where it's not driven by sort of short-term, short-sighted.
Oh, absolutely.
Bad.
Yeah.
Like ultimately bad for society sort of reasoning.
Yeah, absolutely. But again, it's very nuanced when they get to the ground level, because you could also take an example of like a theater co-op or a small worker co-op of like say 20 or 30 individuals who contributed for 15 years, and then they're all reaching retirement.
Yeah.
And in theory, they could keep it around for the next generation, but they could also just sell the assets off and use it to retire, right? So I mean, I argue that it really depends on the.
No, these are hard decisions. I mean, there was this sort of a home heating co-op in the town I grew up in that was like a worker co-op for a number of years, and then everyone got to retirement age and they didn't have anybody interested in sort of taking it over, so they sold it off, and they got all kinds of assurances that they would keep, all these different things. But then that company who bought it from them gave them a nice big payday. Yeah. Then sold it to another company. And now it's just like, totally. Yeah, absolutely. Decoupled from any kind of value system that they had before. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, there's a lot of stories in Quebec of insurance demutualizations where, the original families are, getting 50, 100K payouts. And it turned out like for years, they hadn't just been taking new members at all. So it was just really just concentrating to the benefit of a few individuals.
It does happen, yeah. I guess we'd have to wrap up. The time has gone very fast, but I did want to ask about the sort of idea of an IPO, an initial public offering. So basically offering stock to, and you'd sort of floated that idea in another interview. I just wanted to see like, where are you at with that? And what does that look like as a horizon for you?
I mean, it's still far in the future. We'd like to be the first co-op in the world to IPO. Based on my readings of the law, it's legal in Canada.
Interesting.
But I mean, the IPO market right now is very bad. I mean, we're very far from it, but even if we were ready today, it'll still be a few years out. Or even like the traditional incumbents and other companies are foregoing the IPO. But I mean, I would like for it to happen for various reasons. I mean, it would kind of give a roadmap for entrepreneurial individuals, investors, the community to get involved more in co-ops. Use a co-op more as a vehicle, right? Because it'd see the kind of exit, liquidity that'd be available to them, right? It would allow more money to come into the sector. It would allow more individuals to have a very clear, again, roadmap of like how to be involved in the sector, right? So I think it's important. I'm not saying every co-op is to IPO, far from it. But I would like to be the co-op that can. And, again, because our governance rights are protected from the economic rights, the IPO shares are not giving people control of the co-op, right? Undue control. There's a certain amount of control they get just from being an economic shareholder, right? And, it's new in the co-op world, but it's something that exists, in the traditional world. Like Zuckerberg calls overwhelming control of Meta, and like, most of the control at Berkshire Hathaway's and, in one class of share, which costs like $250,000, right? So it's not unheard of. It's just, no one's ever done a co-op where like there is no way to purchase that voting share without actually becoming a member.
And I guess just to come back to several points ago, are you offering equity to your developers? Is that
everybody? Every employee is involved, including drivers. Get stock options that are vested over the year.
And do they get significant dividends from those at this point, or
no? I mean,
or is it more the share value that is the incentive?
Yeah, I mean, typically for a startup, where the dividends are reinvested into the company to keep growth going. So, I mean, we probably wouldn't see any dividends or very minimal dividends until I'd say the 7 to 10 year mark.
Okay.
Where
so it's really just the value of that equity that you could then sell to another investor at some point.
Yeah, exactly. So I mean, at some point,
if you had a future IPO, then at that point,
at an IPO, or if there was a secondary, which is a moment where they could sell it to other investors or other entities. Right.
Yeah, fascinating. I do want to ask you, I sort of intended to get into this a lot earlier in the conversation, but I got my, I sort of started to nerd out on some of this stuff, which is amazing. Hopefully the listeners agree with me, but I wanted to ask about the sort of food system in general and how, I guess more globally, like the role of tech and data and sort of where you would see that playing a role in a food system that could be more sort of decommodified, that could respond to human needs as opposed to, I mean, we're seeing like massive inflation in the food market.
Yeah.
And so I guess, do you see a role for something like Radish or something adjacent, but doing some similar things in providing consistent, affordable food, but also connecting people to like local producers?
Yeah.
Stuff, the basic food movement demands that are there. Like, what do you see as the horizon for that?
I mean, the crazy thing is that there's enough food in the world for everybody multiple times over.
Yeah.
Right. The challenge is the logistics of getting the food to the people that need it and the economic concerns that kind of block that from happening. Right. Because everyone's trying to protect the fiefdom, whether it's due, and now we see with tariffs, but, whether it's due to protecting a local industry or whatever, you're preventing food from going to the right place. Right. And I think having a more democratic model is going to help fight that. And also, especially data, right? Like the importance of data is that it shines light, in these dark areas where those kind of like, those kind of like inappropriate margins are often hiding, right? I mean, like for example, like in the recent inflation of like the cost of, groceries, right? Like we're all blaming the supermarkets and, they are to blame to a certain extent. We actually, as a consumer, you have no way of knowing where the cost actually is. So you're blaming the supermarket. We're blaming the supermarket because that's our exposure. That's where you get your customer service. We don't know if it's the transporter. We don't know if it's the government. We don't know if it's the farmer. We don't know if it's just everyone's fault or no one's fault. We don't know if it's like, there's just not enough yield. Like you only get pieces of information, right? And I think having data and transparency and integration on every step of the way helps move that information closer to the consumers and then closer to every buyer so that, and seller so that, we can kind of, get more appropriate prices, right? Mm-hmm. If maybe supermarkets are buying from certain buyers simply because, they think they need to maintain that relationship long-term because the other buyers won't be as reliable long-term, but the data will show otherwise. Mm-hmm. Right. It's just this lack of information allows for this kind of arbitrage to happen. Right. And when you get more information, it's harder to arbitrage things. Right. You can have more, you can have better pricing. Right. Which means that, the kind of the keep by the third party is lower. Right. And also, there's also a question of like empowering smaller players through infrastructure, right? So I think things like Radish really help there. We have a lot of, for example, a very concrete example, we deliver a lot of products like, salads and falafels and breads from like, small local businesses who, if they were to work with a larger company, it would cost them twice as much, right? Now, the larger companies take a commission, right? When they're distributing to a grocery, the distributor might take up to a 40% commission. Right. Our costs, and we don't use a commission model, but our costs usually for those deliveries are around 15 to 10 to 20%. Right. It's enough for us to like be operational. Right. So those players, if they weren't,
so you can introduce efficiencies through controllable logistics.
Yeah.
Its own by,
because if those players weren't using us, they would either have to use a distributor and pay twice as much. So it would totally prevent them from entering some grocery stores where they don't even have enough market share. They're making falafels and they can't sell to the store because the consumers don't know about their product yet. And their falafels are better falafels and they're cheaper and they're local, but they can't because the bar is too high for them to get in. The alternative is often they have to like get a van, right, and drive themselves. So now they lose 1 or 2 days a week just driving around delivering, wasting gas. And like all these small companies have their own vans, right? Rather than using our van 7 days a week, split up between 7 members, right? So I think the kind of information disparity and like the disparity in the infrastructure available to these smaller merchants, I think if we're able to kind of tackle those issues over time, it's going to make food more affordable, more accessible to everyone. And I can go on lengths. There's a whole other.
No, yeah. I mean, it seems like you can really decrease the environmental impact of food delivery.
Yeah.
As well,
another thing is we can deliver it faster, right? So when you have delivered faster, you're making less food because you can do smaller batches, you can do less waste, right? Because you can use less preservatives. You can actually change the type of food you sell simply because you can get it delivered. You can get it delivered today.
Yeah, if you're saying, okay, once a week or once every 2 weeks we're gonna send like 2 dozen falafel like packages to the grocery store, and maybe they sell half of them. Yeah, maybe they don't. But if you're doing it every 3 days or something, then you can say, okay, well they're out, or they're not. And we're not.
So you're getting fresher food, right? You're using less preservatives,
and you're tracking the data too.
And because otherwise, what would happen is that the producer would have to first take it to the distributor, which might be like the grocery stores might be in downtown, and the distributor might be in East Montreal. So you're going from the West Island to the East Island to then just come downtown, when we could just go to it direct.
Exactly.
Right. So yeah, there's a lot of areas where things should be more made efficient, and I'm just on a local level, but this can be applied on a global level.
Yeah, and the way I understand sort of like a solidarity economy model, like right now, like as you said, there's like a lot of lack of transparency. There's a lot of opacity when it comes to, who's taking what cut. And so my mental image of sort of how the food supply system is happening is like, oh, oil companies raise their prices by 10%, and then grain commodities go up by another 10% because people speculate on the rising price, and then somebody else next in the food chain, the I don't know, shipper or the regional distributor says, okay, well, I'm gonna because that price adjustment is happening, I'm gonna add that 10%, but I'm gonna add a little more, just because it's an opportunity to take a little extra and nobody's gonna notice. Yeah. And by the time you get to the point of sale, and the grocery store is, saying, oh, it's a 5%, and then all of a sudden, like everything costs like $5 more, even though the like price of that initial shipping fee or even the commodity price is like possibly even negligible when it comes to the impact on the final sale price. But because everybody's like adding on that little cut, it is it's death by 1,000 cuts in some sense. So, but that's my sort of mental model of that. But in a solidarity economy based food system, you could actually look at the whole of the value chain and say, okay, what are everybody's needs, and what are the ways to like distribute this more efficiently, and what are the ways to make it more local, and what, like, from the farm, like we talk to the farmer, what are your needs? Like, what, it's not necessarily just pay me more per beet or whatever. It's also pay me, like, I'm producing this many more beets, and so maybe we need a storage facility to like spread out the beet distribution, so we're not like having a flood in like 1 week and then like nothing the rest of the year. And maybe it's we can talk to the restaurants and have like promote beets in one particular week of the year, and then becomes like Borscht Week, and everybody has a big festival or something. Like there are creative ways that we can operate in solidarity with each other, and then meet everybody's needs. And then you talk about the price that people pay at the end, and making sure that that's efficient as well. And if everybody can communicate transparently, then you can have a negotiation that meets everybody's needs without everybody sort of just like taking whatever they think.
But that's why, like, the access to information is super important, and also the speed at which things are done, right? Because in your first example, that yes, there is like obviously market players that have greed, and it's natural to want to take as much of a cut as possible. That's a human instinct to do that, but usually that comes from logistical challenges, in the sense that like you can't move something, right? So you have to pay a premium to have that moved. right? And when you're able to have a more fluid supply chain, that's when you can have your latter example where like, oh, I know I have to get these beets to Montreal tomorrow. Then it makes sense. Then you can have a discussion, right? Because like the discussion is going to lead to a result fairly quickly, right? Whereas like when it's decoupled, you have to rely on middle individuals to do that, right? Because when you need the beet is very different from when they provide the beet, right? So you need distributors, you need storage companies, and by making that more streamlined, those facilities, go from being, places where they have to hold and sell and like, take a higher premium to like enable that to places which just act more as hubs to like efficiently get things to where they need to get to.
Absolutely.
Right. So I think that's like the big kind of, push we're trying to do from the bottom up, from the smallest players, is like, how do we make this more streamlined so that, we can have that kind of.
Is there a farm to table vision for Radish, or are you doing?
I mean, we work with some organizations locally that have that vision. We've also worked with farms and other, kind of producers, direct producers, right? So I think it'll definitely have a more important place in our model over the years. But there are also more significant costs involved, right? Because you're taking a raw product and there's some degree of processing that must happen. Even if it's just as simple as like, applying the sticker label on every beet, right? Like, I don't know, but like there are other intermediary steps, and like we haven't gone to that point where we have the technology to do that in a kind of streamlined way. Because again, the big thing for us is being streamlined. So, if we're taking parcels from somebody, we need to be able to inject into a system without adding a lot of kind of, extra labor, right? To essentially keep the prices low and the system efficient.
Do you think you could eventually Radish could eventually play like a coordination and capital allocation role in in a local food market?
Yeah, I mean, we might participate in that manner. I mean, I think it depends on, because one thing we're mindful of is not trying to, breathe up all the oxygen in the ecosystem, right? There are other players, other community members and organizations that are also trying to do that. So we're always going to try to come in a way where we, accentuate the kind of existing efforts, right?
But the logistics are key.
Yeah.
And the data specifically is a key role.
Yeah, absolutely. But I mean, there are other players in logistics as well. Like there might be storage or, we're always trying to work with existing methods. If in a market there's a demand from our members to do that, like absolutely. Right. And that's the other thing, like we always act on the demands of our members, not just purely on, our kind of like utopian kind of, Factorio video game scenario. So if
that's my preferred scenario.
Yeah. So I mean, if the opportunity presents itself and there's a desire internally to do that, then we'll absolutely do it.
So Borscht Festival in November incoming, sponsored by Radish.
And Borscht Fest all year. I mean, there's enough beets in the world to make it happen. It's just getting them steer on top.
Absolutely. All right.
Yeah.
Well, buy sour cream futures, everyone.
Yeah.
Great. Well, Mansib, thanks so much for coming on and